The sprawling mansion of millionaire Richard Lawson stood like a fortress of glass and steel, but inside, chaos reigned. His 5-year-old twins, Ethan and Emma, were infamous not just in the household but across the entire city's nanny agencies. Every professional nanny who entered through those polished doors walked out within 48 hours, exhausted, humiliated, and sometimes even in tears. The twins were clever, mischievous, and fiercely united in their mission to destroy any outsider who dared to replace the mother they barely remembered. Richard, buried in business meetings and boardrooms, felt powerless. Each failed nanny was a reminder that wealth could buy everything but peace in his own home. The latest nanny had quit that very morning, storming out with her hair in tangles and her voice trembling as she shouted, "They are demons in disguise." The household staff exchanged weary glances. They had seen it all before. The children would tie shoelaces together, spill juice deliberately, set off alarms, and once even locked a nanny in the bathroom for hours. Richard, usually unshakable in the face of billion-dollar negotiations, sat in his office with his head in his hands, wondering if his children were destined to grow up without stability or affection. He couldn't bear the thought that they were becoming wild, untouchable, and broken by grief. Then came her arrival. Grace Daniels, a woman with kind eyes and a calm presence, stepped out of a modest taxi in front of the mansion. Unlike the others, she carried no airs of superiority, no expensive handbags, no nervous glances at the looming gates. She was not from a prestigious agency but had applied directly, her resume handwritten, her references simple but heartfelt. The staff rolled their eyes, certain she wouldn't last an afternoon. When Grace walked into Richard's office, he studied her carefully. She didn't flinch at his stern expression. Instead, she smiled and said softly, "I don't want to tame your children. I just want to understand them." For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard felt a flicker of hope. The twins, however, had other plans. The moment Grace entered the playroom, they launched their attack. Blocks thrown across the floor, paint smeared on walls, shrieking laughter as they tried to scare her off. But unlike the others, Grace didn't raise her voice or run for the door. She sat calmly on the carpet, letting them circle her like little predators. Then, to their shock, she picked up a paintbrush and joined them. Instead of scolding, she began painting wild swirls across the paper, laughing as though chaos was art. The twins froze, confused. For the first time, an adult wasn't trying to control them. She was meeting them in their world. That first day, Grace broke the invisible wall no one else had managed to cross. She listened to their stories even when they made no sense and laughed at their jokes even when they were nonsense. When bedtime came, the children staged their usual rebellion, throwing pillows, pretending to be monsters, but Grace sat between their beds and began to tell them a story. Her voice was low, soothing, filled with imagination. Slowly, their eyelids grew heavy. By the time Richard peeked in, expecting disaster, he found both twins curled up peacefully, asleep for the first time in weeks without screaming. He stood there in disbelief, watching Grace stroke Emma's hair as if she had been part of their lives forever. The days that followed shocked the entire household. Grace wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. She taught the twins to bake cookies, turning flower fights into laughter instead of tantrums. She transformed their mischief into games with rules, teaching them patience without them even realizing it. The staff whispered in amazement as they passed the open doors of the playroom, seeing the children sitting quietly, drawing or building towers. For Richard, each evening became a revelation. He began coming home earlier, drawn not by business deals but by the sound of his children's laughter echoing through the halls, a sound he hadn't heard since their mother's passing. Yet Grace's magic wasn't just in discipline, it was in healing. One rainy afternoon, when the twins started crying after finding an old photo of their mother, Grace didn't rush to distract them. She sat with them, tears in her own eyes, and said, "It's okay to miss her. It's okay to be sad." She encouraged them to talk about their mother, to remember her warmth rather than fear her absence. For the first time, Richard saw his children grieve openly instead of hiding behind tantrums. He realized Grace wasn't replacing their mother. She was helping them keep her memory alive while finding joy in the present. Word of Grace's success spread quickly, and other wealthy families began calling, offering her double, even triple the salary to come work for them. But she refused every offer. "These children need me," she told Richard firmly. "And if I'm honest, I think I need them too." Richard couldn't help but notice the sincerity in her eyes, a warmth that money couldn't buy. He began to see Grace not as just an employee, but as the anchor his family had been desperately missing. Late at night, he found himself thinking not of his failing marriages or his ruthless deals, but of the gentle woman who had done the impossible in his home. But peace never lasts without challenge. William, Richard's business rival, mocked him at a gala, sneering that the great Lawson can't even control his own children without hiring a miracle worker. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because Richard realized how vulnerable he had been before Grace. On the drive home, he glanced at her in the rearview mirror, sitting between his sleeping twins, their heads resting against her shoulders. In that quiet moment, he understood something deeper. Grace hadn't just saved his children, she had saved him too. She had reminded him what it meant to be a father, not just a provider. As weeks turned into months, the impossible became the new normal. The twins woke each morning excited, ran to greet Grace with hugs, and begged her to join every adventure, from tea parties to soccer games. The mansion, once filled with echoes of shouting and slamming doors, now brimmed with laughter, music, and warmth. Richard found himself lingering at the breakfast table, joining in silly conversations he once would have brushed aside. Slowly, the icy distance between father and children melted, replaced by a bond that had been waiting to bloom all along. And at the center of it all was Grace, the woman no one believed would last a day, yet who had done the impossible by teaching a millionaire's broken family how to love again. The harmony in the Lawson mansion seemed too perfect to last, and soon enough cracks began to show. One evening, Grace discovered Ethan hiding under his bed, clutching a small box of trinkets that belonged to his late mother. His eyes were red, and when she asked what was wrong, he whispered, "If I laugh too much, I'll forget her." Those words shattered Grace's heart. She realized the twins' mischief hadn't only been rebellion, it had been fear. Fear of forgetting, fear of replacing, fear of losing the only memory they had left. Grace hugged him tightly and promised, "You'll never forget her. She lives in your laughter too." That night she made a new ritual, lighting a candle at dinner and sharing one memory of their mother. Slowly the children began smiling through their tears, learning that love wasn't erased by joy. But the more Grace healed the twins, the more Richard began to notice something unexpected, the light she brought into his own life. He found himself drawn to her conversations, lingering in the kitchen just to hear her laugh, watching in awe as she balanced gentleness with discipline. One evening, as they walked in the garden while the twins played, Richard admitted softly, "You've done more for them in weeks than I could in years." Grace shook her head. "No, Richard. You were always enough. They just needed someone to bridge the distance." The vulnerability in his eyes that night was something she hadn't expected from a man known for being untouchable in the corporate world. But the outside world rarely allowed peace. A tabloid photographer snapped a picture of Grace holding Emma's hand outside the mansion, and headlines soon screamed, "Millionaire's nanny or new flame?" Overnight, gossip spread like wildfire, turning Grace into a target of both envy and disdain. The staff whispered behind her back, neighbors raised eyebrows, and even Richard's business partners questioned his judgment. Grace considered quitting to protect the children from the storm, but Ethan and Emma clung to her, sobbing, "Don't leave us." Richard stood firm. "Let them talk," he told her. "This house needs you. We need you." And for the first time, Grace realized she wasn't just a caregiver. She was becoming part of the family's heartbeat. The scandal only fueled William, Richard's rival, who tried to exploit the situation. He invited Richard to a dinner party and slyly mocked him in front of others, hinting that his empire was slipping because he was distracted by a nanny. Richard's temper flared. But before he could respond, Grace, who had accompanied him only at the twins' insistence, stood and calmly said, "Perhaps some people measure success by money, but others measure it by the love they give their children. Which one truly lasts?" The room fell silent. William's smirk vanished, and Richard felt a rush of pride unlike anything he'd felt in years. Grace hadn't just defended him, she had defended their entire family. Back at the mansion, the twins seemed to sense the shift. They began drawing pictures of their family, stick figures of themselves, their father, and always Grace in the middle, smiling. Emma once slipped one of the drawings into Grace's bag with the words, "Mommy Grace," scrawled underneath. Tears welled in Grace's eyes when she found it. She never wanted to replace their mother, but in the pure honesty of children, she had already filled a space no one else could. She pressed the drawing to her heart, whispering a promise to herself that she would never betray the trust these children had given her. Still, Grace carried secrets of her own. Late at night, she would sit by her window staring at an old locket that contained a picture of a child who wasn't there anymore. Few knew that Grace herself had lost a baby years before, a grief she had buried under layers of silence. Perhaps that was why she understood the twins' pain so deeply. One night, Richard found her in the garden with tears on her cheeks, and though she tried to hide them, he gently said, "You've healed us, but who heals you?" For a long moment, Grace said nothing, then finally whispered, "Maybe being with your children is the only healing I'll ever need." Richard couldn't deny his feelings any longer. The walls he had built after his wife's death, the armor of wealth and authority, all began to crack in Grace's presence. She wasn't intimidated by him, nor impressed by his fortune. She saw only the man who desperately wanted to be a good father. One evening, after the twins had fallen asleep, he confessed, "Grace, I thought I was hiring a nanny, but what I found was someone who gave me back my family." His voice trembled as he added, "And maybe even gave me back myself." Grace looked at him with tears in her eyes. Torn between gratitude and fear of crossing a line she swore never to. The mansion once filled with emptiness now overflowed with laughter, but life wasn't done testing them. Ethan fell gravely ill one night, his fever soaring. Panic rippled through the staff, but Grace stayed calm, cradling him in her arms and humming softly until the doctor arrived. Richard watched, his heart breaking at his son's weakness, but also swelling with gratitude for the woman who held their world together. When Ethan recovered days later, he whispered to Grace, "I knew you wouldn't let me go." Those words etched themselves into her soul, binding her to the children more deeply than ever. As spring turned to summer, Richard invited Grace and the twins on a quiet getaway to the countryside. There, far from flashing cameras and whispering critics, they lived simply, fishing by the lake, cooking meals together, watching sunsets in silence. For Richard, it was the first time he felt like more than a millionaire. He felt like a father, a man, a human being. For Grace, it was the first time in years she felt like she wasn't running from her past. One evening, as the twins ran barefoot across the grass, Richard took Grace's hand. No words were needed. Their hearts spoke a language of gratitude, trust, and love too fragile to break. When they returned to the city, nothing was the same. The mansion no longer felt cold. It was a home. The twins, once untamable, now flourished under Grace's care, excelling at school and shining with joy. Richard, once hardened by loss, became softer, more present, a man transformed by love he hadn't expected to find again. And Grace, who had once been doubted by everyone, stood at the center of it all, the woman who had done what no one else could. She hadn't just lasted more than 2 days. She had taken a broken family and stitched it back together, piece by piece, until the impossible became a miracle they all lived every day.